Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program meeting here at Coast to Cascades Bird Alliance. It's a good day to be a duck, and by that I mean ducks don't get wet. Also, ducks can sleep with one eye open, and I know nobody will be doing that tonight because we're looking forward to a really exciting talk with Tom. Before we introduce him, I want to tell you about a campaign that National Audubon is running. It's a postcard campaign, and they're getting people from all over the country to write into their congresspeople in Washington, D.C., asking them to support the Local Communities and Bird Habitat Stewardship Act. All you have to do is fill out the postcard, leave it in the back. We'll get it mailed for you, and we'll deliver it to our representatives in Congress. It's a real good bill. It would provide funding for some of the things that we want to do here in our communities to support birds. So please consider signing the postcard. I think there's some floating around on a clipboard, and there's some in the back of the room. You can do up to 3 senators, reps, yeah. So fill out 1 to 3, and we'll get them mailed in for you. And here in the state, we're very happy to report that the transient lodging tax, the small hotel tax on overnight stays, 1.5 or 1.75% for wildlife has just passed the House in Oregon. And we're very excited. We've been working on this bill for years. It would be a source of funding for the Department of Fish and Wildlife to support all wildlife and not just game species. So we're really excited about this, and we're hoping it goes through. I know Dennis is going to introduce Tom, so I'm not going to talk about Tom at all, but I do want to mention how much we value our partnership with the Eugene Natural History Society. We share many of the same members. We go to many of the same talks. We co-sponsor a talk in December, and it's such a great partnership. So we're really happy to have Tom here. And I'm going to pass it over to Dennis, and thank you all for coming tonight.
The relationship between the Eugene Natural History.
Well, as you know, I never start out by introducing our speaker. I have to tell you about what's coming up. So next month on March 24th, we're going to have Dan Gleason as our speaker. And he's going to talk about an unusual subject, I think, but it's really fascinating. Bird feathers and the colors on bird feathers. Not only how birds, you all have seen a hummingbird and how it flashes that color on its throat. But he's going to talk about all of that, why that happens, and also about what iridescence is. And what is so amazing about how Dan does this is it's one of the best explanations for this feather color situation that I've ever heard. It's just so clear, and it just makes you, when he finishes talking, have a real clear understanding of how it all works. And so it's really amazing. So that'll be next month, right here, same place. Oh, well, tonight we have a fellow who considers himself to be an amphibian biologist, also a geneticist, a forager, father, grandfather, and free-range philosopher. He also got a PhD in something called evolutionary genetics of lungless salamanders. I mean, obviously he was out for the big money jobs. So he ended up here in Oregon, and he decided that, with all of this knowledge he had to become a teacher. And so he became a teacher at the University of Oregon, designed a class in amphibians and reptiles of Oregon, taught that class for 25 years here. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He also became a writer, very good writer. He also does poetry. He's got a blog that is really interesting. So there is a link to the blog in the information on the website. Just a lot of amazing things. Plus, as Debbie mentioned, he's the president of the Natural History Society. So he does everything. And also, he comes to places like this to let us know a little bit about his favorite subject. And it is a fascinating subject, salamanders. So please give a great warm welcome to Tom Titus.
I'm so happy this microphone's working. Thanks, Dennis and Debbie. I promised that I'd first of all say how much I appreciate having all of you in here and have me talking about animals that are completely featherless. That's terrific. But I did promise one of your members that I'd try to find a bird link to the talk, and it's this. As part of this book project that the title of the talk, Breathless, is actually a book that I just handed a manuscript off to Mountaineers Books for. And one of the chapters is a trip down to the Siskiyou Mountains looking for an animal called the Siskiyou Mountain salamander, and even more difficult, an animal called the Scott bar salamander that I will not talk about tonight beyond this. Two of the people that were helping us look for those animals were geneticists from an institute out in Humboldt County. And what they were interested in was getting a little smidgen of salamander tail and getting some DNA out of it so that they could have the wherewithal to test the DNA content of barred owl pellets to see whether or not there were salamanders in their diet. And it turns out there are. They are eating the likes of rough-skinned newts, which you're going to hear more about tonight. So there it is. There's my bird salamander connection for tonight. I have no idea whether my slide changer is going to work, and it doesn't much matter. We'll give it a go here. Yeah. So here we go. What we're going to do tonight is start out, by talking about amphibians in general. And I just give you a little background information that hopefully will make a lot of this stuff make more sense. And then it's just a series of 4 stories that all come out of the book, actually. And the book's a series of 10 chapters, each a separate story about going out into the field and looking for salamanders. A lot of salamander biology built in along the way. So that's going to be our order of events. So let's start right in. Amphibian skin. Amphibian skin is amazing, unlike your skin, which is completely boring. And there's one of my favorite beasts right there, a lungless salamander by the name of the Organensitina. So how would you describe an amphibian skin? Slimy, slippery, moist, porous. Okay, great. Any others? Shiny, yeah. Warm or cool? Cool. Yeah, good. I think you got all of them. Good job. This crowd must know something about natural history. It's awesome. So yeah, that's exactly right. So let's go and dive in and talk about what it is that makes all that happen. And I just do that with this cartoon right here of an amphibian skin and cross section. It's complicated. We think of them as simple animals, but that's a complex skin. There are glands called hedonic glands, which is, yes, related to the word hedonism. Those are the glands that make pheromones that they use for communicating and reproduction. There are these granular glands, which make toxins right here. And importantly, the mucus glands, this sort of vase-shaped structure right here, make them slimy. All of that is contained within this dermis. So the dermis is really complex. Importantly, there's a cross section of a capillary there. And if you were to look at a lot of skin, you'd see a lot of capillaries. So what's the take home right there? There's blood flow really close to the surface of this animal. And also vastly important, the epidermis, this outer layer right here, is very thin, exquisitely thin. I think exquisite is an exquisite word. It's a really thin skin, okay? So what does that mean? So there's a coastal giant salamander. That animal's about 10 inches long, actually, that individual. And it is, fun facts to know and tell, the largest terrestrial salamander in the world. We have them right here. This one was found out near Honeyman Park. So let's just kind of summarize this amphibian skin. First of all, it is champion when it comes to gas exchange. Oxygen comes in through that skin easily, and importantly, carbon dioxide can go out. But the trade-off is, because that epidermis is so thin, it's lousy at hanging onto water. So these animals are great at gas exchange, but not so good at hanging on to their water. They tend to dehydrate. In fact, your average amphibian, and it varies a lot across species, but an average amphibian is going to lose water through their skin unless they're in a nearly saturated situation, either sitting inside a moist log or in the water itself. Okay.
Right in there.
And then we have this really complex dermis with these glands that produce mucus and toxins and pheromones. It's amazing, just amazing stuff. I once said that a salamander, I think beyond its eyes, it almost experiences life through its skin. And I often wonder what that would be like for us if we could do that, if we could actually live through our skin the way a salamander can live through its skin. Okay? Eggs. So an amphibian egg, unlike that really complex skin, actually is a really simple sort of arrangement. And there's a frog egg over there on the left and a salamander egg here with a stalk on it on the right. And not all salamander eggs have a stalk, but they often do. Frog eggs pretty much never do. So right there in that green, I colored that, right? You know, that's not real. So the green spot is where the actual ovum is. That's where it's going to be fertilized and going to get cell division and get this embryo developing. And that's surrounded by a layer called a capsular chamber. And then there are just some jelly layers around there. Important take home there, so there's no shell. Amphibian eggs never have a shell, only that. And there's an example of some amphibian eggs. That's the northwestern salamander. And each one of those little green colored, each of those is an embryo. So each of those represents a separate egg capsule in this larger egg mass in all that jelly. And I'm going to have a little more to say about that later on. So no shell. They desiccate really easily, and they have to be deposited in water because of that, or in a very moist place, like in a rotten log or in a rock pile way underground where they're never going to dry out. Again, close to 100% humidity. And we'll talk about this a little later too, but often that is facilitated by a female who broods the eggs until they hatch.
What is that two-handed big man?
So salamanders, being amphibians, that thing's talking to me. Salamanders, being amphibians, are really closely tied to water, obviously, and we're pretty fortunate, especially here the last several days, right? There's plenty of the stuff. We have a lot of water. And we tend to think of water in this form, surface water of various sorts, but in fact, it's water in all its forms. It could be water vapor. It could be water in the ground. It could be water in a decayed log. One way or another, these animals need that moisture. And so if we look at a climate map, a rainfall map, actually, of Oregon, all you really need to know is purple and blue is a lot of rain and not so much for orange and pink. And you all know from living here that once you get to the Cascade Crest, rainfall drops off dramatically because of the rainfall shadow created by the Cascades. We get a little bit of a rain shadow effect here from the Coast Range going into the Willamette Valley, but then for the most part, we're very well watered on this side of the state. So most of the salamanders are on this side of the state. And in fact, we have 19 salamander species in Oregon. 11 of those can be found in the Coast Range, and you can find 12 species in the Cascades, but there's a lot of overlap between those two regions. There's just a bare handful that don't show up outside of the Coast Range and the Cascades. And I'm cheating a little bit there because I'm counting the Siskiyous as a separate sort of physiographic province. And there are some animals, just like with plants, that are endemic to the Siskiyous. And we actually went to visit some of those as part of the book project. You don't get to hear that story tonight, though. You got to buy it. Sorry. So you see a distribution. This is a typical distribution of a salamander for our state. This is dun salamander. You can see about how long that animal is. That's full grown, a fully grown adult. A lungless salamander, you'll learn more about a little later, and recognized by this olive stripe on the back and the way the black pigment is infused into the edge of the stripe gives it a kind of raggedy looking appearance. And then the stripe stops always just before it gets to the end of the tail, which is a great feature to look for unless they're missing their tail. And sometimes they are, they give them up. So that's a typical distribution all up and down the coast range and into the Cascades. This is artificial because in fact, you don't find this animal on the Willamette Valley floor. So that's too coarse grained really, because these animals like cold seeps and springs, and we don't have that kind of habitat here on the Willamette Valley floor, but you get the idea. The other thing I really like to talk about, and I had a blast when I was writing the book, is how old these animals are. They have been around for a long time. And I often use that as an excuse to kind of get our human-induced hubris damped down a little bit, right? They've been around, humanity's been around for a few million years. Salamanders actually began diversifying 175 about million years ago. Long time. I mean, even just this one family that you are going to hear about tonight, the torrent salamanders, the forest torrent salamander species have been diversifying for 20 million years. There are two animals, actually a number of animals in this lungless salamander family that are close relatives, closest living relatives. They diverged 30 million years ago. It's amazing. I wonder how many million years we're going to last, quite frankly. Okay. So 4 breathtaking stories, because they are breathtaking, and they actually are largely breathless, because remember that thin skin, right? With all those capillaries, lots of gas exchange through the skin. Well, this animal is completely breathless. It's a lungless salamander. There's a family of salamanders. Every one of them is completely without their lungs. That is such a speciose family that it represents the majority of salamander species in the world. So to think of it as some kind of weird little anomaly that maybe doesn't work all that well is probably kind of wrong-headed. They've done great, okay? Speciated like crazy. So this is the Oregon slender salamander. That animal's about that long. I gotta say right up front, they're my babies. I love them. They're my favorite salamander. So I'm sort of starting off with my best punch first here. And I've titled this Denizens of Decay. You'll see why here in a little bit. So just beautiful brick herringbone pattern, brick red on the back, long elongated body, short legs. They are one of about 22 other species of slender salamanders, all of them distributed to the south, mostly down in California. And they get more slender and longer than these. That's a stocky one, actually, as slender salamanders go. Come on, there we go. So they're found in mature conifer forests on the west flank of the Cascades. So these are our iconic, old growth forests. So they have that going for them. They are only found in Oregon. They are only Oregon endemic. I don't know why. They go right up to the Columbia River and stop. And not all salamanders do. Lots of species cross the Columbia River, but they don't. I don't know. They don't like Washington. They don't go there. Okay, so there are only endemic, and yes, we do need a state amphibian, and I'm working on it. Actually, throwing in with some people, other salamander folks, mostly out of Oregon State, that. We're drafting a letter right now to get to the legislature to get us a state amphibian, because I think maybe only about 18 states don't have a state amphibian. So I mean, we need to get with the program here. We got a bottle bill, for crying out loud. We can have a state amphibian. no lungs. And you know how they get away with that, right? They can get all of their gas exchange right through their skin. They cheat on it a little bit. They do have nostrils and they do have a mouth, and they do get some gas exchange across those surfaces as well. But most of their gas exchange happens via their skin. And they can live and reproduce without any freestanding water. Oh. And I love questions. So I'm pretending like you're my students here. How can they do that? But you don't have to answer, because then you'll throw me clear off my game. How do they get away? How do they get away with reproducing without standing water? And the answer is twofold. One, decayed wood is absolutely critical to their habitat. It absorbs water during the wet times of the year, and it hangs on to it right through the summer drought. And that's vastly important for these animals. They can be out and about when it's wet. But come summer, they get into those logs. And that's also the time when they lay their eggs. And those logs are, not only are they holding a lot of moisture, which we know is important, they're absolutely, they are salamander smorgasbords. I mean, they're just full of invertebrates. Someone once said that a tree really only begins to live once it falls on the ground and starts to rot, because there's this whole community of living things, including a lot of other plants, that begin to inhabit that decayed wood. So it's really amazing. But here's the kicker. They do this thing called direct development. And what that means is they put their eggs in these wet logs. The females never leave them. The female stays in there and she keeps her body coiled around those eggs. The embryos actually develop gills, and they go through metamorphosis inside the egg capsule. So those gills, there they are right there, just get resorbed like they would if we were talking about an aquatic larva, and they hatch into this terrestrial juvenile. So they go through metamorphosis inside the egg. So my students hated my multiple choice questions, and I don't blame them. They were heinous. But one of the questions would always be, well, do lungless salamanders have metamorphosis? Answer: yes, they do. Thank you. You're fast learners. You'd have killed it on my exams. They do. They go through metamorphosis inside the egg, and that's how they can do this thing, how they can continue to reproduce generation after generation without any freestanding water in their environment. And you can imagine how helpful that would be in a place like those steep Western Cascades, where there really isn't that much water around, freestanding water around. Okay. Breathtaking story number 2. I got to rip through this so I can read a little bit. Except I don't, there it is. Space monsters. Debbie, do I need to stay put for them to see me on Zoom? Okay. It's a hard one for me. I'm 1,000% kinesthetic, man. It's in constant motion. Space monsters. There they are right there. This is a northwestern salamander. That animal is about that long. It's pretty good size, not giant salamander size, but pretty good size. And the first time I showed one of these to my lovely wife, she's the one that said, that looks like a space monster. And what she was really responding to were these bulging glands on the side of the head, right? Those are called parotoid glands or parotid glands. And those things are just loaded with, remember back when we saw the cross-section of the salamander skin, those granular glands, those poison-producing glands, piled in there, okay? If you do something really unfriendly to this animal, like pretend like you're a bird with your finger and peck at it a little bit, that's not nice. But they will respond by coiling their body in this sort of thrash and they slap their head back and they slap their tail forward. And if you look after a minute or so, you'll see this white ooze starting to appear. And that's, it's toxic, but it's mildly so. Mostly it's foul tasting. And of course, it's an anti-predator compound that discourages them from being eaten. So adults migrate to the ponds in late winter. These last few days have been perfect. Why I was at home and not out driving some vacant country road somewhere along a waterway looking for migrating northwestern salamanders. What was I thinking? I'm getting old, okay? This is the time when it happens. And the females and males get together and they go through this courtship. And this is just a really sketched out basic thing where they approach and there's some nudging and there's some tactile stimulation going on there. There's also some chemical communication going on between this pair of salamanders, and they circle around, and eventually, if the female cooperates, the male gets to climb up and clasp her from above, and that's called amplexus. It's not copulation, it's just amplexus. He's just hanging on, okay? And the whole game right there is to get that female to pluck a sperm cap off of his spermatophore. And that spermatophore looks like a great big huge thing right there. It's about 4 or 5 millimeters tall. And it has that little cap of sperm on it. And so his whole shtick is to communicate to her that he's the best idea around and to get her to then come across that spermatophore and pluck off that sperm cap with her cloaca as the common reproductive and excretory opening down at the base of the tail in amphibians. And so the bottom line is it's internal fertilization. So it's not like fish or frogs that fertilize the eggs outside the female's body. Those eggs are being fertilized inside her oviducts via that packet of sperm that she picks up. And all of our Oregon salamanders engage in internal fertilization. Every species here has internal fertilization. By the way, I got to keep track a little bit. I could stand up here and tell stories and tell you people just tipped over. I'm doing all right. Ask my students. I Googled because I was wanting to double check the size of that spermatophore. And, you know, you get that AI option in your Google search now. So I said, my question was, how big is a salamander spermatophore? And the answer came back 4 to 6 inches. That's quite a salamander. Reminds me of a really bad old joke that we don't need to tell right now, but yeah, that was amazing. So take home message, right? AI will always give you an answer. Always give you an answer. So after all of that, then this thing happens. I need a drum roll. Boom. There's that egg mass. Yeah, that's pretty big. It's huge. And this is my co-author, artist Emily Poole, and she's holding that egg mass. And she said the thing that I knew was going to endear me to her forever. I could hold this thing all day. We don't want to do that. We want to put it back in the water so that they can go ahead and develop and hatch. So, question, how does something that size come out of a female salamander, basically the size diameter of a big Cuban cigar? Good guess. Yeah. It doesn't happen that way. You're right. It's not that big when it comes out. Yeah. So the female has some glands around her cloaca that generate this jelly. And she's actually making a string of eggs in that jelly. And she wraps those things around a submerged stem or a piece of grass or something like that. And that jelly is, magic word, hydrophilic, meaning it's water light. It just sucks up water like crazy. And so that's how it gets to be so big. And I didn't ever used to talk about it or think about it, but I had a 6-year-old kid ask me that question. And that's one of the easy questions I've been asked by 6-year-old kids. More on that later. But yeah, so that's how that goes down. So this is some of Emily's artwork. And this is supposed to represent the same. Ambystoma gracilis are the northwestern salamander egg mass. And notice that even though they're the same, they're slightly different colors. And you can notice that the embryos are actually pretty tiny here, and they're actually larger here. So this one's later in time, and this one's greener, okay? So what's going on there? Well, that egg mass is really dense, and that jelly is really dense, and it actually is an effective barrier against egg predators. So put a little arrow right there, because Emily's greener, later in time egg mass has that, see that dent in it up there? That's where a rough-skinned newt's been perched eating the embryos on the outside of that egg mass. And you'll almost always see those egg masses, they'll be pocked with hollowed out places where the rough-skinned newts have been eating the embryos. The downside is oxygen doesn't get into the middle of that thing very well at all. So the reason that thing's green is because there's a symbiotic alga that grows inside the egg capsule. And that alga is, it's photosynthetic. It's making oxygen as a result. And in return, that embryo is producing this nitrogenous waste, ammonia and other things, and that fertilizes the alga. And so over time, these egg masses become greener and greener. And it's a neat thing to watch. When they first go into the pond, they're actually just clear. It gets weirder. Those algal cells can actually be integrated into the embryonic and larval tissues. It gets weirder. If you label the carbon that goes into your little experiment and let the alga photosynthesize basically and make labeled carbon chains, you can see that the salamanders are actually using those as an energy resource. So you've got this little photosynthetic salamander out there running around. Whew, you know, to my knowledge, it's the only photosynthetic vertebrate anybody knows about. And this is true. Actually, this has been shown for a close relative of the northwestern salamander, but dollars to donuts, it's happening the same way here as it is. That's the eastern spotted salamander that most of that research has been done on. Amazing. Breathtaking story number 3. I used that photograph. I just found this, and I used to think it was kind of dumb. But then I looked at that a couple of days ago and I went, God, I love that picture, you know? And I love it for its color, and I love it for the glimmer of the water. I love it because there's this torrent salamander right there. That's a Columbia torrent salamander. You can see how it's cryptically colored against the rubble. And I love it because it shows the habitat and what that animal really needs, which is clear, cold water and clean rubble without a lot of silt in it. I love that picture. I took it by accident. I also love the scientific name of the Columbia torrent salamander. It's Rhycotriton kieseri. How many people know Jim Kieser? Knew Jim Kieser? Yeah, Natural History Society folks knew Jim. He was my first salamander mentor. He took me on my very first formative salamander adventure to Costa Rica a long, long time ago. And it was really because of Jim that I got involved with the Natural History Society. And it's because of Jim that I was able to take a field trip to a place called Hidden Lake. That was Jim's favorite place in the world. And so when these 4 species were described, they named this one after Jim, which I really appreciate. The downside of working on torrent salamanders is they all look alike. And I don't mean by individual salamander they look alike. There's variation in the individuals. There's our Columbia torrent salamander, Southern torrent salamander, Olympic torrent salamander, and Cascade torrent salamander. On an individual basis, there's a fair amount of variation from animal to animal, but the variation overlaps between species to the point that you can't tell the species apart with really any kind of characters at all. But they really are mostly geographically isolated from one another. The Olympic torrent salamander here on the Olympic Peninsula, that gives way going south to the Columbia torrent salamander. Notice how it crosses the Columbia River there. To the east, we have the Cascade torrent salamander. I actually think that map's a little off. It drops further down south than that. But notice how it also crosses the Columbia River barrier. And then here in the south, we have the southern, appropriately named the Southern torrent salamander in yellow. There's a place where the Southern torrent salamander actually leaks over into the Cascades. And it's about the only point in that system where these things overlap one another geographically. And they're genetically very distinct. So there's a chunk of DNA that was sequenced from a gene. These are all the different populations and species of torrent salamanders that they used in this study. And essentially what I'm showing you is the variation in bases at those particular positions. And you can see that they're all different from one another. They all have these unique genetic signatures. Tremendous amount of genetic work now being done by a graduate student at Oregon State right now, Chris Cousins. And Chris, did you make it? No. Yeah, he's doing a huge amount of work. Just had a paper come out on the biogeography of Cascades torrent salamanders. Other fun facts. The adults and the larvae look a lot alike, especially that's a larva right there. There's the adult right there. If you look at it, you can start to see some things, like notice how high the eyes are up on the head here and how lower down they are and how much flatter the head is in this larva. And you can see a little bit more of a tail fin here in the larva than you would in this transformed individual. But that larva is just getting ready to metamorphose. It's just about to transform. They have to have these cold seeps and streams with a lot of dissolved oxygen in the water. Why is that? Well, the adults are nearly lungless. And in fact, if you look at a big salamander tree, and I don't show you one right now, you'll see that lungless salamanders and torrent salamanders are actually pretty close together on that tree. And it poses an interesting question as to how the lungless salamanders actually managed to get away with jettisoning their lungs completely, because the torrent salamanders were actually on their way. The larvae have tiny little gills. Sorry, I hate to do this to you, but see that little red right there? That's a gill. No, no, I don't see it. Yeah, tiny little gills. They don't need to expend a bunch of energy developing big froofy gills, because there's so much oxygen in the water. They can get their gas exchange handled by what? Their skin. Yay. Okay. The larval period is really long, 3 to 5 years it takes before a torrent salamander can metamorphose. Both the larvae and the adults are aquatic. So these two animals are found in the same habitat, essentially. That's really unusual. And torrent salamanders have been diverging for 20 million years. And so when you look at that distribution map and you see those species crossing the Columbia the way they do, how long has the Columbia River been cut through the gorge? Long time, 17 million years, long time. So I'm thinking the salamanders were there before the Columbia actually cut through. Chris would be horrified to hear me stand up here and say that, because he's actually a real scientist and he wants to really, really know. And I just get to tell stories now. So Who knows? That's a great question. Longevity is something we know very little of about in these salamanders. But so the question, yeah, was how long? I have a salamander aficionado who, if you ever need any construction work done, his company is called Salamander Construction, and there's a reason for that. Andrew loves salamanders, and he helps us with our salamanders for the Natural History Society booth out at Mount Pisgah when we do the Mushroom Festival and the Wildflower Festival. So Andrew has a long-toed salamander that was an adult when he got the animal and has been with him for 30 years. Yeah. Our immediate past president of the Natural History Society, Stan Sessions, was given an adult Northwestern salamander. So she probably was 10 years old when he got her, and she lived 20 years with him. A tagged larval coastal giant salamander out at H.J. Andrews has been recaptured for 25 years. How long? I don't know, but maybe a long time. So how do you tell these species apart? Well, go teach yourself some fancy genetics. I did fancy genetics for most of my career. This is a great way to make a living, but y'all don't need to do that. That's a much better solution. You hit the road. Because they're geographically isolated, the best way to identify a torrent salamander is to figure out where you are, either on your phone or with a paper map. I don't care how you do it, but you got to know where you are. And so Emily and I hit the road, and it was rough. I mean, it was rough work. We had to go to some really god-awful places, but these are the places where torrent salamanders live. So we sacrificed ourselves in the name of, I won't call it science, but this book project. Just beautiful spots. And I'll just kind of cut to the chase and not belabor the entire story. But this was Emily with an Olympic torrent salamander in her cupped hands. And I came to know this pose very well from doing field work with Emily over the years. I call it that I have a salamander look. You recognize it from a long way off. And so there she is with an Olympic torrent salamander. And that was the fourth of the four species in our Grand Slam, torrent salamander Grand Slam. And we recognize it's maybe not quite the same as a birding big year. We get it. But for us, it was really a lot of fun. And I wrote a whole chapter in the book around that project. And there's some of Emily's artwork. And I think I'm doing okay on time. I'm going to take a little break here and read you, as far as I know, the only ode to a torrent salamander ever written. Just want to have to shift into my serious poet voice. It's kind of a reach. It's called Triton. Sweet coltsfoot huddled in an almost spring ditch, ivory blossoms patient beneath red alder with vertical geographies of gray lichen scattered on white trunks. Water weeps from somewhere high on a steep bank, trickling beneath sandstone cobbles softened by moss. Afternoon light carries cloud quilt, mist cling, subdued expectations. A stone turned with care, hoping you're there. Yes. A squirmy glisten, an extra finger curled in my palm, back a smeared cocktail olive, belly an aging lemon, entire body scattershot with salt and pepper, Columbia torrent salamander. Your name evokes pledging cascades, not this shy peak of late winter water. You climb onto my thumb, perhaps a better view. Dark eyes stare with childlike intensity into my dark eyes, your mouth with corners upturned as though both of us are smiling. But you will be happy only beneath this mossy rock, free to someday tell silent tales of abduction and escape. Last tale. Oops, okay. Toxic tale of citizen science. Rough-skinned newt. Most of us think this is the most common salamander in our area. The reason we think that is because that's the salamander we see. The most common salamander in our area is actually a lungless salamander called the clouded salamander, and it's all over town and you never know it because you have to go out there with a headlamp right now in the right spot with it nice and rainy and dark to find them. But rough-skinned newts are out marching around. Question, why do they get to be out there marching around? They're so toxic, nothing can eat them. Okay, like I like to say, why can they do that? Or why are they out there? And the answer is because they can be ultimately. So, whoopsie. So some rough-skinned newts have enough nerve toxin, neurotoxin, to kill 10 to 20 adult humans. Woo-hoo. Question, how can that be? Works like this. The toxin's called tetrodotoxin, and it's a smallish molecule, and there's a cartoon of it right there. And this is a cross-section in cartoon form of a nerve cell. And nerve cells work because they have channels. Whoopsie. They have channels. I can get the right button here. And these are, the fancy name is voltage gated sodium channels in their nerve cells. And so what happens is the sodium piles up outside the nerve cell. And when an impulse goes along this thing, this thing is what they call depolarized. Basically, it allows the sodium to rush inside. And that's how a nerve cell is propagated all along the way by this inrush of sodium. Tetrodotoxin works by stuffing itself in those sodium channels like a soccer ball in a sewer pipe, and it blocks them. Nerve impulses cannot be propagated in the presence of tetrodotoxin. Then all kinds of weird things happen, like you forget to breathe and various other life important activities. So it's vastly toxic stuff. So question, what happens if you pick a rough-skinned newt up with your bare hands? And that's a little mating ball. Actually, there's a couple of males there trying to amplex, trying to mount a female. There's a lot of competition that goes on there. Some of you maybe have seen newt balls. There's a female in the middle of that. And in the meantime, the males are trying to dislodge one another. And so, I mean, since that's my hand in that photograph, the answer probably ought to be fairly obvious. Nothing happens when you hold a rough-skinned newt in your bare hands, except that you become very happy, and not because of the toxin. They're just a joy, okay? Question, what happens if you eat a rough-skinned newt? Yeah, you die. And I guarantee you, you won't die happy. You'll get to enjoy the full paralytic experience. And there are some published accounts of newt, bona fide accounts of newt poisoning. Generally, they're preceded by an overconsumption of alcohol. And they generally afflict young males ages 20 to 25. Poorly developed frontal lobe, way too much testosterone. Somebody dared them to do it. Oh yeah, I had a quarter of a bottle of whiskey or whatever more. And yeah, I can do that. No, you really can't. So, but there are animals that can eat them. And some of those animals are garter snakes, and that is our red-spotted garter snake. We have these right here in the Willamette Valley. Our newts around here are especially toxic. And so how do they do that? How do they get away with that? Well, the really short answer is their nerve cell channels have evolved protein differences that keep that tetrodotoxin from binding. That's how they do that. It still makes them kind of stupid. Okay. They get slow. All right. So there's a cost to it. And it turns out there's also a cost to having nerve channels that have been modified like that evolutionarily, because the snakes aren't as agile as they would be otherwise. Okay. That's how it works. I'm thinking barred owls get to eat these things too. I don't know how they do it. Other fun facts. Garter snake resistance and newt toxicity are regionally correlated. By that, I mean, if you go to a place like, for example, Southeast Alaska, where there are newts, but no garter snakes, the newts have lost their toxicity. Here, the snakes are highly resistant. Likewise, if you find a population of garter snakes and there aren't any newts to prey on, the garter snakes aren't resistant. They've lost their resistance because there's that trade-off, right, to being resistant where you're not quite as agile and you might just find yourself lunch for a red-tailed hawk instead of looking for a newt, for example. The other cool thing is that tetrodotoxin is actually produced by a bacterium that lives on the skin. Weird. And this is relatively new research, at least for an aged person like me. All work done by a graduate student at Michigan State, of all places, who showed that there's this Pseudomonas on the skin of rough-skinned newts that make all that tetrodotoxin. And the newts are rough because those granular glands are all piled up in those little bumpy things, okay? And that's where they manage to sequester all of that nerve toxin, actually, even though they're not making it themselves. It's a crazy system. And finally, and it should be of no surprise, the rough-skinned newts are resistant to their own nerve toxin. So if you look at the genes that code for their sodium channels, you'll find that, in fact, they've all evolved all the resistance they need. So part 2 of Toxic Tale is a little project that I have going on at Tugman Park. And here's a timeline for Tugman Park. And I, turns out, moved back to Eugene. I actually grew up not far from here and was gone for a long time going to grad school and doing all kinds of, what dentists call it, not exactly financially remunerative activities, like getting a PhD in salamanders, for example. 1925, we just filled, everybody know where Tugman Creek is out in southeast Eugene? Yeah, so just upstream from the park itself, the flat area, is a gully, basically, and they filled it with trash. And they filled it and filled it and filled it and filled it until 1956, they finally decommissioned it and covered it up. Now, in 1995, so some almost 40 years later, they started finding lead and a bunch of other contaminants in the creek and in the soil and the residences around the park. And so in 95, rather than turn it into a Superfund site, which would have been hugely expensive and probably never would have happened, the city of Eugene actually figured out that they could reroute the creek around the dump. That was genius, okay? And because it was relatively inexpensive and essentially solved the downstream problem. The dump's still there, don't get me wrong, and it's not great, and I wish we hadn't done it, but back in 1925, that's what we did, you know. So following that, there was a whole restoration project around Tugman Creek below the dump. They added some meanders to the stream where it used to just be a straight flush right through the park, planted a bunch of riparian vegetation. It was amazing. So in 2016, it's a long old story I won't bore you with, I became the Pied Piper of Newtdom. And we started a program with Nearby Nature called Wow Newts. And so every third Saturday in April, kids and their various caregivers and I get together out at Tugman Park, and we teach the kids about newts, and then we go out and count every breeding newt in the creek. It's a fantastic project. We've been doing it now for 10 years. And this is one of my stars right here. You can tell she looks like she has a death wish, doesn't she? I mean, holding that newt like she it's been great fun. And not only that, we have data. No, we're not counting every newt in the population. I get the shortcomings of all that, but we're very consistent. We go there the same time every year and make these counts. And I can tell you that after a long increase that went up to like 95 newts in that short stretch of creek, all of a sudden, about 2 years ago, we went out there and it was 25. Boom. And went out there last year and it was about 26. So something happened, and people keep asking me, what? And I don't know, but I keep saying, we don't know, but we at least have the data to know that something happened, right? So it's been a fantastic thing. And I'm going to wrap up by just reading a short piece from the end of the chapter. It's entitled Neighborhood Newts. Be really great if I didn't drop that mic, huh? This is just the last couple paragraphs. In a 1982 essay entitled Children in the Woods, the late Barry Lopez was, as usual, thinking far ahead of his time. He recognized that the most important gift we can give young folks in wild spaces is the sense of relationship rather than the minutiae of names and facts. Lopez understood that a deeper experience of the living world can be found by expanding a specific instance, like newts, such as the discovery of a raccoon jaw that includes all the relationships that put, for example, that bone in that place, in that time. And this set of relationships includes humans. The newts of Tugman Park mingle with raccoons fattened on pet food, opossums scavenging compost piles, obese red squirrels robbing bird feeders, yappy little dogs, bird and rat-eating cats, and the non-native humans who aid and abet this partially domesticated hybrid ecosystem. Lopez gave early credence to an idea I've championed for years, that the job of raising kids, the job for all of us growing up and growing older, is to become less self-centered, more inclusive. We can measure the quality of our lives to the extent that we invest in our connection with others. Other refers to all beings, human or not, animate or not. Other certainly refers to newts. In the leaf-rotting rain of late winter, I stretched my arms wide in gratitude for the people who taught me to fall in love with science and the wonder of salamanders, for a future-thinking city that sent cleaner water flushing through my neighborhood, for an organization devoted to anchoring kids to their place, and for an opportunity to squat with children in the mud and show them another marvel in their local world. Mostly, I'm grateful for the persistence of rough-skinned newts, toxic but not dangerous, waddling resolutely through the rain toward our neighborhood creek. Big thanks to all of you for having me in. And the Spring Creek Project sponsored Emily and me in a residency that kicked this whole thing off. Mountaineers Books is publishing this thing that I've written, and all my salamander mentors over the years. And there's Emily with, there's that giant salamander. I told you it was 10 inches long. That's the same one I showed you a picture of earlier. She said, when I took that picture, you can take 1,000 pictures of me. my wife, Kim, has made a lot of these trips with us. There, she's not holding a salamander. She has her little heart that she's showing off. And finally, of course, the salamanders themselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was great. We will have some time for some questions and answers. And I would just ask you to repeat the question so that people on Zoom would.
Champion.
Okay, great. So go ahead.
Okay, well, starting back first. Yeah, go ahead. That's a great question. So the question was, are the rough skin newts dangerous to your hand if you have an open wound? And I'll tell just a little story about that. The person who did the pioneering research on newt toxins was Edmund Brody Jr., otherwise known as Butch, who was at Western Oregon State. It was Oregon College of Education then 20 years before I was. And the story is he was actually, hate to say it, but he was skinning a newt to extract the toxin to try and figure out what was going on with the stuff. And he jabbed himself with a dissecting needle in that process. And he sat there with his lab notebook and recorded the amount of time it took for the numbness to creep up his hand, and it stopped right about his wrist. So he did not die. He went on to have a very successful career. But yeah, it's I would say it's not dangerous, but you don't want that to happen. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So great question. The question is, did newts and salamanders evolve from fish? And I'll try to put it succinctly. It turns out that fish and all these amphibians, that the eggs that I was showing you a picture of, they don't have any of the membranes that are associated with eggs in what we call amniotes, which include mammals and reptiles for that matter. So they share the gills and the eggs and the cold-bloodedness, which I don't like that word too much, but they share that with fishes because they were hanging on to those from an ancient common ancestor. So yes, not exactly. When I show a tree of the amphibian, the big tree of amphibian evolution, there are a gob of extinct species that really muddy up the works in terms of being able to say, what they evolved from. But ultimately, they did evolve from a fish-like ancestor. What are you thinking? Do it. Does that help? Yeah. Oh, by the way, that also means that a lot of people, they'll look at a salamander and a lizard and go, well, those are really closely related, right? In fact, you are more closely related to a lizard than a salamander is. Okay. True story. Again, because of those egg structures, those are what unite us with those animals exclusive of amphibians. There we go. Okay. Yes. I like the way you framed that question as a role. I often get asked, what good are they to us? Oh, sorry. The question was, what role do amphibians have in the environment? Or could we say salamanders? Either one, right? So you didn't ask what good are they to us, because I would always answer, and I'd sound like a complete smartass, which I kind of am. What good are you to them? But they do some amazing things. For example, salamanders are, in some ecosystems, the most abundant in biomass of any vertebrate in those systems. And they eat so many invertebrates that would normally be chowing down on decayed leaf litter, that they actually have an impact on the global carbon cycle. There's one. Okay. Another thing that's really fascinating about them, not for the lungless salamanders, who I said have direct development, don't have to go to freestanding water, but for amphibians that breed in freestanding water, they're essentially moving nutrients from the terrestrial system into that aquatic system and then back out again. They do that. They're also food for a lot of things. I once caught a big brown trout over at Sun River years and years ago, and it disgorged a long-toed salamander right in front of me. And I had to say, it's kind of rough to see, but yeah. So thanks for asking. I'm going to go, oh, I can see bunches of people in the back. Right there. Sorry, I don't know your names. If this was the Natural History Society, I'd be calling you by name probably.
If there are any local salamanders that have gills.
Oh, I love that question. The question is, do any local salamanders have gills as adults? And the answer is yes. They're not exactly adults, but they're sexually mature. And so what happens in those coastal giant salamanders, that animal I showed you a picture of is a metamorphosed adult, but those animals have the ability to stay in the creek, stay in the water, and become sexually mature as gill-breathing larvae. And they look, for all the world, like a larval salamander: flat head, small eyes, pretty subdued coloration, and big froofy gills. But they're sexually mature and they breed. And they can also breed with the transformed adults that show back up in the water. So yeah, the answer to that is yes. Howie.
Symbiosis with green alga, is it the same one? What was it?
That was about 3 questions. Let me see if I can. So the first question was, is it a green alga? And the answer is yes. And the second question was, help me out.
Well, one of them was is it one of those symbiotic?
Yeah, the short answer is, if you go out and sample, you will find them living outside the little salamander system.
The third was, or it's the same.
Yes. And in fact, it has a very cool name. It's called Oophilia, so egg-loving, Amblystomatus, and Ambystoma is actually the genus of these mole salamanders, where there is this symbiosis. And there are some other amphibians as well that have that symbiotic arrangement. And I don't know if it's the same alga in those as it is in these salamanders. Thanks. Jerry.
Limits, specifically North America, Canada. So how far north would any salamander be found? And obviously temperature is a main factor, but how would that specifically influence the limits?
So the question is, so what we're trying to think about here is the distribution of, we'll just say salamanders, to focus it in a little bit. And in terms of how far north or south they get, and what the role of especially temperature has on them. But I would throw in also moisture, because in fact, for Bill Bradshaw said this years ago in biology over at the U of O, you can explain the distribution of any organism. It's 80% temperature and moisture, those two things. Those are the big factors, right? So the easy part is, salamanders go up to the southeastern, the panhandle of Alaska, and that's about it. And I'm thinking at that point, it probably is temperature that starts to exclude them. The growing season maybe just gets too short, but there are a few that get up that far. Going south, that's a different deal, right? Because now you're going not so much from too cold to too hot and dry. Turns out that Oregon ensatina that I showed a picture of, the ensatina complex goes from essentially British Columbia south all the way down to Baja. And they, I don't know how they do it, but they're the champions. There's no other salamander with a distribution that variable latitudinally, mostly along the coast. But they also, the cool thing is they split at the Sierras at the north end of the Central Valley, and they go down the Sierras, and then they go down the Coast Range, and they've evolved into all these just wild color patterns along the way. And back to birds again, it turns out some of those patterns are actually adaptive when it comes to cryptic coloration. Scrub jays, you can show, for example, are less prone to eat some of those color morphs than others because they can spot them more easily or not. So
One more.
one more question. Who gets the prize? Oh, I think I saw you first. I'm going to hang out though. Okay. I'll be here. Oh, I think he's going to relinquish to you. Thank you. Salamanders and, oh man.
Salamanders and.
So the question is, do I know anything about salamanders and fire? And the answer is, in one of the chapters, the large mountain salamander, it's a lungless salamander that's found mostly up in the Columbia River Gorge. They do go further north up into Washington, but they're on the Washington and Oregon sides of the Columbia River Gorge. So another one of those things that got split by the Columbia River. We, on our trip, specifically went to look for large mountain salamanders outside the fire zone of the Eagle Creek fire. Remember the Eagle Creek fire? Oh yeah, you do. Trauma sticks with you, right? That was the one that burned in the Columbia River Gorge that was set by I'll just say a firework and poor judgment. And so we specifically set out to look for them outside the burned area. And then we wanted to see if they were in the burned area. And in fact, they were. And so those animals can survive that because they are able to get down under these talus piles, where there's been some studies on pikas where they've put thermal sensors down into those talus piles and found that there's, like, even during a fire, there's almost no change in temperature. So they can survive those fires underneath that stuff. The big question, though, is what happens when you come back up? Because all of a sudden you've got a moonscape. And I didn't say this during the talk, but a closed overstory is often a really pretty critical habitat feature for a lot of salamanders. And so there's an anecdotal answer, and there's going to be a lot more coming out because of the Lookout fire up at H.J. Andrews. The salamander people are all over that. And they're going to know a lot more. For example, they noticed a great big uptick in the number of metamorphosed coastal giant salamanders in